The moment my stepfather's voice cut through the entire rehearsal dinner wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the silence that came after 47 people holding their breath, silverware suspended midair, every eye in that room finding somewhere else to be except on me. "This chair," he said, pulling it back from the table like he was presenting a trophy, "is for Kelsey, my actual daughter. You understand?" He didn't phrase it as a question. I was 31 years old. I had flown in from Portland 2 days early to help set up the venue. I had addressed 212 envelopes by hand because my mother said it was more personal, and I was standing in the private dining room of the Whitmore Hotel in Cincinnati holding a glass of sparkling water, being told by the man who had slept under the same roof as me for 19 years that I did not belong at his daughter's rehearsal dinner table. I set down my glass. I said, "Okay," and I walked out. That's what everyone saw. What nobody saw was what I did 3 hours later, sitting alone in my rental car in the hotel parking garage when I opened the email my father had left me. My father died when I was 22. Pancreatic cancer, diagnosed in March, gone by August. That kind of fast. His name was Douglas, and he was the kind of man who kept paper records of everything: utility bills from 1987, warranty cards for appliances he'd thrown away years prior, receipts from hardware stores in alphabetical folders in a cabinet in his garage. My mother used to tease him about it. She called him the last man in America who still balanced his checkbook by hand. After he passed, I took one box of his things. Just one, because I was 22 and living in a studio apartment and I didn't have room, and I told myself I'd go back for more. But then my mother remarried 14 months later, and going back to that house became complicated in ways I didn't have words for yet. The box sat in my closet for 9 years. Journals, some photographs, a few folders of documents I couldn't bring myself to open, and a USB drive taped to the inside of a manila envelope with my name written on it in his handwriting, Lee. And underneath that, one word: wait. I don't know why I never plugged it in. Fear, probably. The particular grief of knowing that whatever was on it was the last thing my father ever wanted to say to me, and once I heard it, there would be nothing left. I plugged it in the night of the rehearsal dinner. My mother had met my stepfather at a grief support group at their church about 16 months after my father's death. His name was Warren, and he had lost his first wife to a stroke 2 years prior. He had one daughter, Kelsey, who was my age almost exactly, 3 months younger, and who had inherited her father's talent for making you feel like you were taking up space that rightfully belonged to someone else. My mother fell in love the way people do when they're lonely and frightened, and someone shows up who seems steady. I understood that, even at 23. I still understand it. What I couldn't understand, what I still cannot fully explain, was how completely she disappeared into his world. Within 2 years of the wedding, she had sold my father's house, the house my father built. 3 bedrooms, a wraparound porch, a garden he'd planted from seed every spring for 24 years. Gone. Warren said it was impractical to maintain and that the equity made more sense invested in their future together. My mother agreed. She always agreed with Warren. I learned not to say anything about the house. I learned a lot of things not to say. What I didn't learn, what I could never quite manage, was how to pretend at Warren's casual cruelties when happening. He never did anything dramatic enough to be called abuse. It was always smaller than that. The way he'd see my mother on emails correcting my mistakes. The way he'd tell stories at dinner about his daughter's accomplishments, and then look at me with that particular blankness, like I'd wandered into the wrong room. The way he referred to Kelsey as his daughter and never, not once in 19 years, called me anything that implied I was part of his family. The rehearsal dinner was just the first time he'd done it loudly enough for 47 people to hear. The USB drive contained 3 folders. The first was financial records, spreadsheets, scanned documents, PDFs of contracts. I recognized my father's company name at the top of several pages. He had run a small commercial real estate consulting firm for most of my childhood, 5 employees, modest but stable. I had always assumed that when he died, the business had simply wound down. My mother had never mentioned it. I started reading. It was close to 1 in the morning. By noon, Her house already bid. Her have called my cousin Adrian, who has a gift of being able to absorb alarming information without audible panic. Adrian, I said, I need you to look at something. It's 2 a.m, Lee. I knew, please. I heard him sigh, then the creak of a chair, then the sound of his laptop opening. I read him the figures. There was a long silence. Where did you get this? He said. My dad left it for me. Another silence. Lee, if these numbers are right, and I'm not saying they are, I need to see the actual documents. But if they're right, someone transferred a significant amount of money out of your father's company accounts in the 18 months after he died. And I mean significant. I looked at the folder name my father had labelled it. Warren Do Not Ignore. My father had known about Warren. Not everything, but enough. The second folder made that clear. It was a collection of notes, dated, methodical, very much in my father's voice, that he had apparently been compiling in the last months of his life. He had met Warren twice, at church events, before my father got sick. He had not liked him. He had written that down specifically. I do not trust this man around Margaret. He has the quality of someone who has practiced being charming. But it was more than instinct. My father had done what my father always did with things that bothered him. He had researched, he had talked to people, and he had found 2 women from Warren's past who had stories that sounded uncomfortably similar to each other. Widows who had dated Warren, who had found their finances slowly redirected, who had ended things and then spent years trying to untangle what had happened to their savings. My father had their names. He had notes from conversations. He had done all of this while he was dying. He hadn't told my mother because he didn't have proof, not the kind that would have landed, and because my mother in those last months was already beginning to pull away from him in the particular way that people sometimes do when they cannot bear to watch someone they love disappear. He had written that too, plainly. She won't hear it from me right now, but she needs to know eventually. I'm leaving this for Lee because Lee will know what to do with it. I sat with that sentence for a long time. He had known even then that I would be the one. The third folder was the one that made my hands shake. It was titled Company, After. My father had a business partner named Clifton, who had been with him for 11 years. After my father died, Clifton had continued running the firm. I had assumed, we had all assumed, that my father's ownership stake had simply passed to my mother as part of the estate. It had not passed cleanly. There was a will discrepancy. My father's attorney had flagged it during probate, a note buried in the case file that had apparently been glossed over in the chaos of grief and paperwork. A second document that contradicted the first on the question of the business ownership. My father's note suggested he had suspected someone had gotten to the filing. He couldn't prove it, but he had kept copies of everything, including the original document, which named me as the inheritor of his business stake. Not my mother, me. I didn't sleep that night. In the morning, I skipped the wedding brunch. I called Clifton instead. I had not spoken to him since my father's funeral, and his voice on the phone was the sound of something I hadn't realized I'd been missing. Someone who had known my father as a professional, as a peer, as a man, rather than just as a husband and father. Your dad talked about you constantly, Clifton said after I'd explained what I'd found. He always said you got his brain for details. I told him everything. He was quiet for a long time. I wondered, he said finally. After the estate settled, things felt off. I didn't know what I was looking for. We agreed to meet in person the following week. Before we hung up, he said, Lee, whatever happened here, your dad made sure there was a paper trail. He always made sure. I did go to the wedding. I stood in the back. I wore a dark blue dress that my stepfather would probably say was too casual, and I did not speak to him, and when my mother found me during the cocktail hour and touched my arm and said in a low voice, last night was, he didn't mean it the way it sounded, I looked at her and said, very carefully, Mum, I need you to call me next week. I have something important to show you. She tilted her head. She started to say something about the timing, about how this wasn't. It's about Dad, I said. About the business, about Warren. The colour changed in her face. Not guilt, not yet. More like the particular expression of someone who has spent a long time not looking directly at something and has just been asked to turn around. "Call me next week," I said again, and I went to find my seat. The next 6 months were not fast. I want to be clear about that because I've seen the way people tell these stories. Everything snaps into place, the villain is exposed, the credits roll. Real life takes longer and costs more and requires a great deal of patience with your own attorney's billing cycle. Here's what actually happened. Clifton and I hired a forensic accountant named Patricia, who charged $400 an hour and was worth every cent. She went through 9 years of company financials and identified a pattern of transfers that had begun approximately 3 months after my father's death, when Warren, who had inserted himself into my mother's financial affairs almost immediately after the wedding, had gained access to her accounts, which had at that point been commingled with the remaining estate assets. It was not a dramatic heist. It was a long, patient train, amounts small enough to miss on a casual review, redirected through an LLC that Warren had registered in Delaware 8 months before my father even died. He had registered it before my father died. I called Adrian when Patricia showed us that. He made a sound I had never heard him make before. The 2 women from my father's notes. My father had their names, and I found them. One had remarried and was living in Knoxville. One was in assisted living in Scottsdale. I reached out carefully, through an attorney, and both agreed to provide statements. The patterns in their accounts matched the pattern in my mother's. Same method, different names. My mother's reaction when I showed her everything was not what I had expected. I had steeled myself for denial, for defense, for the particular devastation of watching someone choose their denial over their daughter's evidence. She sat at my kitchen table in Portland. She had flown out at my request with the understanding that I had something serious to discuss, and she looked at the documents for a very long time. Patricia was there. Adrian was there by video. My mother is not a stupid woman. She is a woman who had been grief-stricken and lonely and targeted by someone who had done this before. When the full picture was in front of her, she did not defend Warren. She went very quiet for a long time, and then she said, "How much?" Patricia told her the number. It was substantial enough that my mother had to set down her coffee cup. "Your father knew," I said, not as an accusation, just the truth. "I knew," she said. "I think I've known that for a while." Warren must serve papers on a Tuesday in March, 14 months after the rehearsal dinner. The civil case involved my mother, myself, and the 2 women from my father's files. The Knoxville woman's daughter, it turned out, had a background in financial investigation and had been sitting on suspicions of her own for years. Our attorneys coordinated. Warren's attorney argued that all transactions had been consensual, that my mother had been aware and agreeable, that the LLC was a legitimate business entity. It took 2 days of deposition for that position to become untenable. The Delaware LLC had no clients, no revenue, no purpose that could be explained in a way that held up under questioning, and the timing of its registration, 8 months before my father's death, during the exact window when Warren had been attending the same church grief group where he would later meet my mother, was the detail that Patricia said she would have built an entire case around, even if there was nothing else. My mother's money was not fully recoverable. Patricia had warned us about that from the beginning, and she was right, but a substantial portion was. The settlement included the house Warren and my mother had shared, which was purchased, we were able to demonstrate, partially with funds that should never have been Warren's to spend. My mother bought a condo in Columbus, small, 2nd floor, with a balcony where she has started keeping plants. She calls me on Sundays now. It is not the relationship we had before all of this, but it is more honest, and I think we are both still learning what that means. The business stake, my father's stake in the consulting firm, was a separate matter, and a slower one, involving probate court and a judge who had clearly seen too many contested estate cases to register surprise at anything. Clifton testified. Patricia testified. The forensic trail my father had started building before he died, and that I had continued without knowing that's what I was doing, held up. The firm is still operating. I'm not a day-to-day person. I have my own career, my own life in Portland, but I am an owner now, in the way my father intended. Clifton sends me quarterly reports and occasionally a photo of the office dog. I look at them and think about my father sitting in his garage, filing receipts into alphabetical folders, absolutely certain that details would matter someday. He was right. He was always right about that. I have thought a lot about the rehearsal dinner, about what it cost me to walk out of that room quietly, to set down my glass without throwing it, to say okay to a man who had spent 19 years making me feel like a guest in my own family. I used to think I was being a pushover. Now I think I was just waiting, not strategically, not consciously. I didn't know then what I know now. But I had inherited something from my father beyond the paper trail, the capacity to absorb difficulty without becoming someone I didn't recognize, to collect information, to wait until I understood what I was actually dealing with. The chair at that rehearsal dinner table was not the thing Warren took from me. He took money, yes, and years of my mother's security, and the home my grandfather helped my father build from the ground up. Those are real losses, and they are not resolved by a settlement figure. But what he cannot touch, what he never came close to, was my father's voice on that USB drive. Patient and meticulous and completely certain that I would figure it out. I'm leaving this for Lee because Lee will know what to do with it. I knew what to do with it. Eventually, I keep coming back to that moment in the parking garage. Not the rehearsal dinner, not the deposition, not the settlement. Just me alone in a rental car at 1 a.m, holding a USB drive I'd been too afraid to open for 9 years. What strikes me now is how much of my life I'd organized around avoiding that moment. The box sat in my closet through 3 apartments, 2 jobs, a relationship that ended partly because I couldn't explain why I carried so much weight from a family I rarely talked about. I told myself I was being careful. I think I was just scared of what my father had seen that I hadn't. Warren didn't lose because I was clever. He lost because he underestimated what integrity actually looks like over a long stretch of time. My father was dying, and instead of spending those last months only in grief, he sat in his garage and built a record. He did it quietly, without telling anyone, without any guarantee that it would ever matter. He did it because it was the right thing to do. Full stop. No audience, no reward. Just a man who believed that the truth deserved to be documented, even if no one ever read it. That's the thing I've had to sit with, not the money, not the legal outcome, but what it means that my father's honesty, practiced privately, in pain, became the foundation that everything else was built on. You can't manufacture that in a crisis. It's either there or it isn't, built up over years of small, unwitnessed choices. I used to think I wasn't like him in that way. I'm more impatient. I don't keep paper records of anything. But going through those folders, tracing what he'd noticed and how he'd organized it and what he'd anticipated, I recognized something. He had taught me to pay attention, to take details seriously, to not dismiss the thing that feels slightly wrong just because it's inconvenient to examine. I had learned that without knowing I was learning it, the way you absorb a person's values through proximity before you can name them. The harder thing, the thing I'm still working on, is what it cost him to stay quiet when he was dying, to trust that I would find it in my own time. That took a kind of discipline I'm not sure I have yet, to hold what you know without forcing it, to prepare instead of react. I spent years being angry at situations I couldn't change, and I called that strength. But it wasn't. What my father did was stronger. He chose the slower, harder response when the faster one wouldn't have worked. Patricia told me once, near the end of the case, that the reason it held together was because nothing had been exaggerated. Every document said exactly what it said. No one had stretched anything to make it fit. She'd worked cases where the evidence was stronger on paper but fell apart because somewhere along the line someone had shaded the truth a little, and opposing counsel found that thread and pulled it. My father never shaded anything. That was his whole method. I think about Kelsey sometimes. She didn't know what her father was. Or maybe she did and chose comfort over honesty. I don't know her well enough to say. Either way, I don't carry anger toward her. What happened to her family is a consequence of choices her father made, and she'll have to find her own way through that. What I know is this: the chair at that rehearsal dinner table was never the point. Warren could take a seat. He could not take what my father left me, not the paper trail, and not what it represented, the belief that doing the right thing quietly, even when it's costly, even when no one is watching, is never wasted. It took me 9 years to open that drive. I think I opened it exactly when I was supposed to.